did men honor Daniel Webster, so did I. I was helped to hate slavery by the lips of that great intellect. And now that he takes back his words and comes himself to be slavery's slave, I hate it tenfold harder, because it made a bondman of that proud, powerful nature.
Daniel Webster was one of Massachusetts' most revered politicians. His distinguished career in government spanned 40 years, and for most of that time he was an outspoken critic of slavery. But when Congress passed the Compromise of 1850, Daniel Webster made his own compromise with slavery. In the interest of protecting the Union, he supported the Fugitive Slave Law. Dishonored in the eyes of abolitionists, Daniel Webster died in 1852. Like Henry Clay, he did not live to see the final unraveling of the Compromise of 1850. But it barely survived Webster himself.
In 1850, as part of the Compromise of 1850, the South gets a new fugitive slave law. And among other things, it allows for the appointment of a federal commissioner in every county in the United States.
It created an entire mechanism for recapturing fugitive slaves. For instance, if you were a commissioner that granted a slaveholder the right to take his slave back to the South, you got more money than if you said, no, you couldn't take the person back.
The law itself is very unfair. It does not give the alleged fugitive slave a right to testify at his own hearing, so that the alleged fugitive can't say, you've got the wrong person.
It said to people in the North, whether they were pro-abolitionists or anti-abolitionists, that they had to now become, in effect, either directly slave catchers or supporters of people who wanted to catch fugitive slaves. This changes the entire political mix.
Most Northerners had no first-hand experience of slavery. When slave catchers came to their towns and cities, many witnessed for the first time its injury and injustice.
In many cases, there are attempts to retrieve people who actually had run away from slavery, but had been away from slavery for a very long time. 10, 15, 20 years. They now had families. They had perhaps owned property in the North. And it struck Northerners as just outrageous that somebody could come along and grab one of their neighbors, the father of his freeborn children in Pennsylvania or Ohio, the husband of a freeborn black woman in one of those states, and simply snatch him and bring him back to slavery.
The Fugitive Slave Law turned many citizens who were formerly indifferent to slavery into abolitionists.
We went to bed one night old-fashioned, conservative, compromise Union Whigs, and waked up stark mad abolitionists.
The Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society instructed that the law should be denounced, resisted, disobeyed, and its enforcement on Massachusetts soil rendered impossible.
By and large, there was open resistance, declared resistance to the law. And the communities organized to make sure that fugitives within their midst, or fugitives who were passing through their community, would not be taken.
Wisconsin declared the Fugitive Slave Act unconstitutional. The Chicago City Council resolved not to cooperate with federal marshals in the enforcement of the law. And the mayor of New York City vowed that his officers would not assist in the capture and transport of fugitives.
One of the ironies of this period is that the states' writers here are the people who are in favor of racial equality, and the people who are opposed to states' rights turn out to be the Southerners. The states' rights arguments throughout the 1850s are made by abolitionists who want their state to be able to protect people in their jurisdiction from the oppression of the national government. What we forget, and this is, again, very hard, I think, for Americans to come to terms with, is the Constitution is a pro-slavery document.
The hounds are baying on my track. Oh, Christians, will you send me back?
For abolitionists such as Theodore Parker and William Lloyd Garrison, the higher law of God as revealed through one's own conscience, superseded the man-made laws that sustained slavery.
Garrison's position is that the Constitution was a wonderful phrase, a covenant with death and an agreement with hell.
There is a higher law, and you know it. It is a rule for political action, and you must obey it.
The non-compliance of anti-slavery agitators and higher law proponents did not have a significant effect on the law's execution, but it was widely publicized in both the North and the South. In Boston, where abolitionism was rampant, sympathizers gave refuge to escaped slaves, and on several occasions even snatched them back out of the hands of their captors. The arrest of Anthony Burns in Boston in 1854 brought the situation to a showdown.
I want that man set free in the streets of Boston. If that man leaves the city of Boston, Massachusetts is a conquered state.
When abolitionists attempted to rescue Burns by force, the attempt failed, leaving one man dead. Their attempts to prevent his departure by legal means were no more successful. And when they tried to buy his freedom, his owner was willing, but the court refused to allow it. To prevent further attempts at rescue, the state assigned 22 companies of militia to guard the prisoner. And President Pierce, determined to prove that the federal government would back up the Fugitive Slave Law with force if necessary, ordered Marines, cavalry, and artillery to Boston. When Burns was marched through the streets to a ship waiting in Boston Harbor, thousands of citizens lined the streets to protest his removal. Buildings were draped in black, and the American flag hung upside down.
And as I thought of liberty, marched handcuffed down that swarded street, the solid earth beneath my feet reeled fluid as the sea.
Several weeks later, at an abolitionist gathering on the 4th of July, William Lloyd Garrison publicly set fire to the Constitution.
So perish all compromises with tyranny, and let all the people say, Amen.
The Fugitive Slave Law inspired defiance and civil disobedience across the North. It also inspired a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe to write a book which would become an unexpected literary phenomenon. Uncle Tom's Cabin began as a series of sketches published in an abolitionist journal. When the sketches grew into a novel, printing presses could not keep up with the demand.
It's one of those books that just reaches and affects people in ways that nobody could have anticipated. I suppose outside of the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress, no book had ever been read and had such an impact as Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 10,000 copies in the first week. It was translated into dozens of languages and became a bestseller in Europe, selling more than 1 million copies in the British Empire alone.
It was in the days when there's no copyright, literally hundreds of thousands of copies here and in London appeared on the streets. I mean, so that it's not only serialized, but it's also produced in cheap copies. Plays are produced based on Uncle Tom's Cabin, and some of the figures and the characters become well-recognized figures that appeal to the sentiments of people who are concerned about the evils of slavery. So in that sense, it reaches the public in ways that Douglass couldn't, or Garrison couldn't, or none of the other abolitionists could.
The Compromise of 1850 had put off the question of slavery in the territories for a few years, but the lure of the West was irresistible. By 1854, Americans were clamoring for new lands to be opened for settlement, and Kansas and Nebraska were first in line. With his Kansas-Nebraska Act, Stephen Douglas, who had ultimately engineered the passage of the Compromise of 1850, became the unwitting engineer of its collapse. Douglas was a tireless advocate of Western expansion. As chairman of the Senate Committee on Territories, he was eager to organize the Nebraska Territory so that it could be opened for settlement. A man of small stature and enormous ambition, Douglas was nicknamed the Little Giant.
He thinks he can bestride this continent with one foot on the shore of the Atlantic, the other on the Pacific. But he can't do it. He can't do it. His legs are too short.
In the 1850s, westward expansion was a dream shared by many Americans. Northerners of the free soil, free labor persuasion wanted western lands open to homesteaders. Southerners were looking for opportunities to expand the dominion of slavery in the western territories. Neither North nor South was concerned about the Indian lands that lay in their path.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act, in effect, opened up this plains area to settlement by farmers and whoever, which meant they were encroaching on Indian lands. So what had to be done with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was a renegotiation of all of the treaties, which was done in the latter 1850s, pushing the Indians and the reservations north to what are now the Dakotas and south into what is now Oklahoma.
Douglas was not concerned with the sovereignty of the Indian nations and regarded them as little more than an obstacle to progress. But he believed in the popular sovereignty of white settlers. To this end, he drafted a bill which would organize two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and allow the question of slavery in each territory to be decided by its inhabitants.
He was dedicated or committed to this notion of popular sovereignty. He felt that was the only way to treat the slavery issue. Now, he could take that attitude and still maintain a kind of anti-slavery view because he knew that slaveholders were not the ones who are migrating to Kansas, Nebraska, Utah, New Mexico, and so forth. The people who were migrating came from the free states. Slave owners were not uprooting their plantations and moving them to Kansas. He also thought that popular sovereignty was a middle ground. He felt it would bring peace to the two sections. He was very wrong about that.
The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act provoked a storm of reaction across the country. As the man responsible for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Stephen Douglas was vilified.
Especially the repeal of the Missouri Compromise aroused a vicious opposition, first of all in Congress, where Douglas was charged with all kinds of heinous things, down on his knees before the slave power and all of this sort of thing. And Douglas returned to Chicago after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in the summer of 1854, and he said when he got to Chicago he could have traveled by the light of his burning effigies all the way by train from Washington to Chicago.
Once the bill was passed, the battle over slavery in the territories moved from the relatively controlled halls of Congress to the open ground of Kansas.
We will engage in competition for the virgin soil of Kansas, and God give victory to the side which is stronger in numbers as it is in right.
While the North was sending large numbers of immigrants to Kansas, the South was gathering its forces in Missouri. At the first election, several thousand pro-slavery men crossed the border into Kansas and voted. The outcome of the election was overwhelmingly pro-slavery, but at least 60% of the votes were illegal. Free Staters elected a government of their own, which established itself in the city of Lawrence, Kansas. In response, a territorial court judge sent a federal marshal with a posse to arrest the Free State leaders for treason. The posse degenerated into a mob, and the town of Lawrence was sacked, its buildings burned, its homes looted, and its inhabitants terrorized. 3 days later, John Brown, a Northern abolitionist, took vengeance for the sack of Lawrence. Estimating that 5 anti-slavery settlers had been killed thus far in Kansas, he selected 5 pro-slavery men at random from a settlement at Pottawatomie Creek and had them executed by his small band of followers. While border ruffians and bushwhackers fought it out in bleeding Kansas, senators and congressmen fought a war of words in Washington, but even there, the rhetoric brought bloodshed. After Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave an anti-slavery speech, a representative from South Carolina named Preston Brooks beat him senseless with a cane on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Southerners congratulated Brooks by sending him more canes. Politics in Kansas became more complicated as the territory prepared to apply for statehood. Free Soilers and Republicans abstained from some elections, while pro-slavery Democrats abstained from others, and both sides stuffed ballot boxes. As delegates to a constitutional convention were preparing a constitution that legalized slavery, voters in the election of 1857 elected an anti-slavery legislature.
The Lecompton Constitution was the effort on the part of the slave power to bring Kansas into the Union as a slave state while they still could, while the population was still in flux. And Douglas saw that as such a travesty, a blow against popular sovereignty, that although it was passed with and promoted by a Democratic president and by Democratic leaders from the South, Douglas opposed the Lecompton Constitution.
Congress refused to ratify the Lecompton Constitution and returned it to the voters. This time, with election controls in place, the Free Soilers defeated it. Stephen Douglas was a man ensnared in his own web. Popular sovereignty had failed to maintain the peace in Kansas. In fact, it had provoked a guerrilla war and delayed statehood for years. More importantly, the Kansas-Nebraska Act destroyed any pretense of harmony between the North and South. The gloves were off, and they would not be put back on again.
We regard every man who does not boldly declare that he believes African slavery to be a social, moral, and political blessing as an enemy to the institutions of the South.
The South, I must say it, is the enemy of the North. She is the enemy of our material welfare and our spiritual development. Her success is our ruin.
The 1850s was a decade of political realignment. The two traditional parties, Whigs and Democrats, were challenged by single-issue movements devoted to abolitionism, anti-Catholicism, anti-immigration, and even temperance. Sectionalism further undermined the two major parties as they divided into Southern and Northern factions.
The Democratic Party was becoming split, not quite there yet, between Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats over the slavery issue. The Whig Party was unable to cope with this division, and after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it went down the drain. It was out. In its place arose the first third-party movement that eventually took on the name Republican Party, a new sectional party.
The Republican Party gathered anti-Nebraska groups, Free Soilers, and abolitionists into one party whose primary concern was the issue of slavery.
And this is an important difference. The Whig Party was a national party with membership in both North and South. The Democratic Party is a national party. Now the Republican Party comes into view as a Northern anti-slavery party. And this, to Douglas, is an ominous situation. If the Union is to be preserved, we can't afford to have these ideological parties.
As the Republican Party came to represent the North, the Democrats increasingly concentrated in the South. By the end of the decade, there was no major political party remaining that could transcend sectional differences. In 1857, the Supreme Court was a decidedly partisan institution. Of the 9 Supreme Court justices, 7 were pro-slavery Democrats. 5 came from slaveholding families. Their desire to secure the rights of slaveholders would cause them to make the most infamous judicial decision in American history. The man who started it all was named Dred Scott.
Dred Scott was a slave born in Virginia. His master ultimately moves him to St. Louis, where he is sold a couple of times and ultimately ends up in the hands of a man named John Emerson. John Emerson is an army surgeon. And when John Emerson is posted to various frontier forts, the first one is in what is today Rock Island, Illinois, he takes Dred Scott with him as his servant. Now, presumably, Dred Scott becomes free the moment he's taken to Rock Island, because Rock Island is in Illinois. It's called Fort Armstrong at the time. But Dred Scott remains a slave at Fort Armstrong. And then his master takes him to Fort Snelling, which is today St. Paul, Minnesota. Now, that is area that was made free under the Missouri Compromise.
Several years later, Dred Scott returned to St. Louis with his master. But after Emerson died, Scott sued for his freedom on the grounds that since he had lived in free territory, he was no longer a slave. A jury of 12 white men in a St. Louis circuit court judged him legally free.
2 years later, the Missouri Supreme Court reverses this. They reverse precedents going back to the beginning of Missouri statehood. And they are very frank about it. They say times have changed.
When John Emerson's widow remarried, she transferred ownership of Dred Scott to her brother, John Sanford.
John Sanford lives in New York, but has business interests in St. Louis. And so now Dred Scott can sue in federal court alleging he is a citizen of Missouri, his owner's a citizen of New York. And that's how the case goes forward to the Supreme Court.
No suit pressed by a slave had ever come before the Supreme Court before. It raised important questions.
The lawyers representing John Sanford made the argument that no black person can sue in federal court because black people can't be citizens of the United States.
The majority opinion in Dred Scott was written by Chief Justice Roger Taney. Taney was a resolute foe of racial equality, the Republican Party, and the anti-slavery movement.
Chief Justice Taney begins by saying Dred Scott can't sue because blacks can't be citizens. And he makes a very famous statement. He says at the time of the Constitution, they had no rights, they meaning blacks, had no rights that the white people needed to respect. Now, having said that Dred Scott can't sue, the technical legal thing Taney should have done was said case dismissed. Because obviously if Dred Scott can't sue, then he can't be in court. Taney can't hear the case any longer.
But Chief Justice Taney didn't stop there.
Taney goes on to face another constitutional question of whether Congress could constitutionally have passed the Missouri Compromise. Did Congress have the power to prohibit slavery in the Western territories? And here he makes an argument based on the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment says you cannot be deprived of your property without due process of law. And so he makes the argument that the federal territories cannot ban slavery because slavery is a fundamentally protected property within the United States constitutional scheme. He says, basically, look, the Constitution is pro-slavery. We have a pro-slavery country. Slavery is a protected property. It's protected more than any other kind of property. And it's protected in the territories. This was also, by the way, essentially a drop-dead letter to the new Republican Party, because the new Republican Party, organized in 1854 after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was based on the theory that you should stop slavery from spreading into the territories.
We fearlessly declare that there never was under the whole heaven a more atrocious, wholesale wickedness perpetrated upon the bench of justice than this.
Such a decision cannot stand. All that is merciful and just on earth and in heaven will execrate and despise this edict of Taney.
The nation has achieved a triumph. Sectionalism has been rebuked and abolitionism has been staggered and stunned.
Dred Scott himself was purchased by the sons of a former owner and set free a year later. But the controversy surrounding the Dred Scott decision did not quickly die down.
It's that third element in the triangle of disasters, I suppose, in the pre-Civil War decade. And that here now the court has joined the politicians in making a decision in this case in which the Supreme Court decides basically that Dred Scott and by extension all black Americans have no constitutional rights that whites are bound to respect.
The events of the mid-1850s radicalized many Northerners and hardened their stance against slavery. And they convinced Southerners that the North was out to destroy their way of life.
Well, it shows that the country is committed, clearly committed to the maintenance of slavery. And that radicalizes a number of people who then say that clearly there's no option but to do something much more violent and much more radical if we're going to bring about change.
Out of this confusion and conflict, a new political party was born, dedicated to ending the spread of slavery. The Dred Scott decision was intended to put an end to the discussion of slavery and to the Republican Party. It had the opposite effect.
The biggest winner in all of this is ultimately Abraham Lincoln. Because what Abraham Lincoln is able to do is to articulate a very careful and clear and easily understood attack on the Dred Scott decision. He eviscerates Tawney in speech after speech after speech. He cuts the Dred Scott decision apart and shows the public, who are not lawyers, who are not sophisticated politicians necessarily, but in very plain Lincoln English with his jokes and with his very kind of homespun articulation, he shows people what's wrong with the Dred Scott decision. And that ultimately makes him the Republican nominee in 1860 and gets him elected president.
I know, and you know, that a revolution has begun. I know, and all the world knows that revolutions never go backward.